The Spanish Empire was the world's largest in the 16th century, dominating the Americas, Europe, and Asia, even as it gained successes. The Spanish were enemies of the Ottomans, French, English, Dutch, and Germans, always surrounded by enemies on all sides with endless wars to manage. And then the question arises, why did the Spanish have so many enemies? How did the gold from Spanish America shape the religious wars in Europe? And why did even Catholic countries like France go to war with the Spanish? How was this empire the victim of the first propaganda war in history? And how does it still affect the perception people have of this empire today? In today's video, we'll explore how the Spanish Empire gained many enemies and permanently influenced world history. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. This gives you access to our group and exclusive content, like live classes, to further explore histories behind the scenes. So we see why the Spanish Empire had many enemies. We need to go back to its origins, with the Catholic monarchs Isabel of Castile and Fernando of Aragon, uniting two great Iberian kingdoms and later conquering the Kingdom of Navarre. Both funded the expeditions that, with Christopher Columbus, discovered the New World. While Castile focused on the Americas, Aragon, which always had a great rivalry with France, took advantage of the union to increase its influence in Europe by conquering the Kingdom of Naples. And besides that, the kings marry several of their children to the kings of England, Portugal, and Flanders to strengthen alliances and surround France. From the Catholic monarchs' strategic marriages and alliances, a vast empire eventually arose, inherited by their grandson, Charles III of Habsburg. Charles was king of Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, king of Naples, lord of Flanders, which was the equivalent of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, in addition to being Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, and later elected as Holy Roman Emperor. He also held the title of Duke of Milan, controlled cities in North Africa, and was king of Spanish America, possessing the largest empire in the world, with the conquests of the Inca and Aztec empires taking place during his reign. His motto was plus ultra, which means further beyond. And under his reign, the first circumnavigation in history was accomplished, with men in wooden ships sailing around the entire globe. And that's how we can understand why Spain had so many enemies in Europe. Carlos carried with him the ambition to be the new Charlemagne and to found a universal polycentric monarchy. In other words, the dream of the Habsburgs was to keep Christendom united under a single king, who should respect the laws of each of his kingdoms. Thus, the laws of Castile did not apply in Austria and vice versa, but both were governed in the name of the emperor, the most powerful man in the world in the 16th century, who planned that with these multiple domains he could establish universal peace. But what Charles achieved was far from that, starting with the Protestant Reformation. The Holy Empire was the stage for a series of revolts and wars waged by the German princes because of the rebellion of an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther. Charles, just over 21 and newly elected emperor, attempted to resolve the issue diplomatically at the Diet of Worms. But when he saw it was impossible, he resorted to arms. And this would later result in the 30 Years' War, the first Great World War in the 17th century. And here's where an interesting point comes in. Since the Catholic monarchs, the Spanish monarchy has always been known as the Catholic monarchy, and thus the Spanish kings were honored as the most faithful kings of the Holy See and the papacy. Before Europe, the Spanish, because of the title, began to use their influence and power to try to suppress the so-called heresy, internally with the Inquisition and also externally by fighting Protestantism. And this also led them to enter the 80 Years' War against the Netherlands, one of the territories inherited by the Spanish monarchs. The Dutch, with strong Calvinist influence, had started an iconoclastic movement known as Beeldenstorm, where many Dutch people entered churches and destroyed paintings, altars, and sacred images. With war declared between the Spanish in the south, loyal to the emperor, and the Flemish rebels in the north, the conflict begins. And this explains why Brazil was invaded in Pernambuco when it was under the Iberian Union. That's because the Dutch in the north were enemies of the Spanish, from whom they wanted independence. And since Brazil was under the Spanish monarch, it ended up being considered enemy territory as well, and therefore a target for attacks. The 80 Years' War resulted in the separation of the Austrian Netherlands, which were Catholic and are now known as Belgium, from the Protestant countries. To the north is Holland, dividing the lordship of Flanders into two countries that still coexist today, and on many occasions, the Spanish textiles even prevented the north from conquering the south. Besides the Protestant issue, another major enemy of the Spanish Empire was the Ottoman Turkish Empire. That's because, in the 16th century, there was one of the greatest Turkish advances through the Balkans, threatening all of Europe. Curiously, when we think about European expansion throughout the world, we don't think about Islamic expansion, which several times almost took over the West. And the Spanish Empire under the Habsburg dynasty was directly involved in fighting this expansion on land. The Turks laid siege to Vienna in a great siege during the reign of Charles I in 1529, with the city bravely resisting. And many of the mercenaries paid to defend the border cities were paid with resources from the New World of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish also joined the Holy League with the coalition called by the Pope to fight the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean Sea. And with that, they played a leading role in the famous Battle of Lepanto, where the Christian forces defeated the Ottoman fleet in the largest naval battle ever fought in the world up to that point, in 1571. We can also mention the siege of Castelnuovo, where 3,000 Spaniards resisted an attack by 50,000 Ottomans without surrendering, delaying Turkish control in the Balkans. And even after the Habsburgs split between the Spanish and the Austrians, the Spanish still continued to help the Austrians deal with the Ottomans. We can cite as an example the siege of Buda in 1686, where 300 Spaniards heroically helped in the liberation of Budapest, taking the city back from Ottoman rule for the Kingdom of Hungary. But interestingly, even though at the core of the kingdom there was a struggle for the Catholic world, one of its greatest enemies was another Catholic kingdom, France. That's because the configuration of the empire practically surrounded French territory ever since the Catholic monarchs conquered the Kingdom of Naples. Wherever France tried to expand, there would be a Habsburg territory. And besides that, Carlos the Further was still the Holy Roman Emperor. In an election, he won precisely against the King of France. Thus, the French actively worked to diminish the power of Spain and the Habsburg dynasty. During the Battle of Pavia, King Francisco X of France was captured by Emperor Carlos in the middle of the battlefield, with the French losing it. But later, the King of France was released under the promise that he would no longer attack Carlos. However, instead of celebrating peace, France joins the Ottomans, more specifically Suleiman the Magnificent, to try to undermine the power of the Habsburgs in Europe. And France, by the way, is the emblematic case of how far anti-Spanish policy went amid the religious wars in Europe and the 30 Years' War. France persecutes Protestants internally, while at the same time in the external war, it sides with the Protestants to overthrow the Spanish Catholics through Cardinal Richelieu. And it also joins forces with the Turks to try to undermine Spanish power in the center of Europe, while they supported the Austrians. And as if that weren't enough, over time, others rose up against the Spanish Empire. A series of smear campaigns in Germany, France, and Italy, which eventually became known as the Black Legend. At the same time that the Habsburgs were winning on the battlefield, like in the Battle of Mühlberg against the enemy princes, This even led Carlos to celebrate with a painting depicting the battle. In the presses and publications spread throughout Europe, the Spanish were portrayed as monsters, genocidal, and intolerant, inhuman beings. So, while Spain was winning the military war, it was losing terribly in the propaganda war, a new and silent war that was emerging throughout Europe and that still shows its effects against the country and its history to this day. And even though more and more researchers and academics today are taking a more critical look at anti-Spanish propaganda, it still leaves many traces. Only the negative points of its past are spread and amplified, while its achievements and accomplishments are reinterpreted or hidden. And this propaganda also served for the empires to justify their invasions of Spanish America. After all, if the Spanish were barbaric and cruel, the presence of the English, Dutch, or French would be seen as a saving solution for the American peoples. And finally, the Spanish Empire ended up attracting the constant rivalry of the English, when they also tried to interfere with the English throne to prevent England from becoming Protestant. Felipe II married Mary Tudor, who was Catholic, to try to get her pregnant and thus generate an heir to the throne who would keep the kingdom aligned with the papacy. But with Mary already being 43 years old, she was unable to produce an heir. And when her rival, Elizabeth I, came to power, she brought with her not only a fervent Protestantism, but also a great hatred for the Spanish, financing several privateer expeditions to try to destabilize the empire. These acts of piracy would lead to the response of Philip II, who would send a grand armada to try to destroy the British Navy, but it would end up being destroyed by a massive storm. And, interestingly, just as Spain worked to strengthen the power of the Catholic Church in Central Europe through the Tercios, Elizabeth I led England to support Protestantism in the same way, providing great support to the Netherlands in their fight against the Spanish and to the French Huguenots in their struggle against the French crown. He still tried to make a move to marry Elizabeth, but ended up being rejected by the Queen, who died without descendants and during her lifetime. He encouraged all kinds of attacks against the Spanish and their allies, and that's how the Spanish cultivated each of their enemies. There are many attempts in history to try to classify the fall of Spanish hegemony from a certain historical moment. For some, it occurred after the victory over the Invincible Armada. For others, after the War of Spanish Succession, which devastated the country in a civil war. But the fact is that even after the Civil War, and after losing its non-Iberian European territories, such as Naples, Spain still tried to reconquer them. This led the Duchy of Savoy, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and France to form a coalition in the War of the Quadruple Alliance to prevent the Spanish from retaking their European territories. In other words, it was literally a war of Spain alone against the rest of the European powers, and Spain almost won, even after an internal civil war of nearly 10 years, and even against all the others combined up until the 19th century. Spain suffered several attempts by the British to take its American territories, like the invasion of Cartagena de las Indias in 1741, and also the invasion of Argentina in 1806. And even with few defending the territory, they still came out victorious. We can see then that if the Spanish Empire had so many problems and so many enemies, it was because of a worldview very particular to that empire, which may have been the first to fully apply the modern concepts of imperialism. The Hispanic monarchy held as its national ideal the spreading of its power and the Catholic faith throughout the world. Whether fighting against the Turks at sea, strengthening the defenses of Christian cities in the Balkans, or combating the advance of Protestantism in Northern Europe. Unlike the modern trading companies that emerged later, such as the Vic and the Voc, which were guided solely by money, the Spanish Empire was guided by a worldview that was still a medieval legacy of the Crusader mentality, crusade. This led the crown to spend fortunes assembling fleets to defeat enemy navies in battles with no financial return, as happened at Lepanto. And this shows how the empire of the Spaniards, designed and built by the Catholic monarchs. Fernando and Isabel played an important role in global geopolitics, and to this day they have left their mark around the world. Did you know these facts? What surprised you most? So, leave your comment right now so we can know your opinion, and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the impressive and fascinating Iberian history.